There was something creepy about the appearance of the little Eskimo village that lay before him. And Trapper Joe LaBelle sensed it as he paused to survey the scene. The icy wind that blew off Lake Anjikuni flapped the skins that hung over the gaping doors of the huts. A few battered kayaks were blown up on the beach. No dogs barked, not a single voice broke the silence. Joe asked himself the logical question: where are the people? It was a very good question on that raw November day in 1930, and it remains unanswered to this day. For many years, Joe had known this friendly little Eskimo village 500 miles north of the Mounties base at Churchill. On this fateful day, he'd gone miles out of his way to cross the frozen tundra to spend a few hours with his friends, only to be greeted by an ominous silence. According to his report to the Northwest Mounted Police, Joe had stopped at the edge of the village and yelled a greeting. He got no reply of any kind, a most unusual approach to this friendly little community. He opened the caribou skin flap on one of the huts and called again. More silence. A similar experience awaited him at every tent in the village. Very spooky, he said to himself, for there was no one else to whom he could say it. Spooky? It sure was, and so it remains. Joe spent about an hour in the village examining it for some hint as to what might have happened to the missing populace. He found pots of food hanging untouched over fires which had been cold for months. In one hut were some sealskin garments for a small child, the ivory needle still sticking the garment where the mother had abruptly ceased her mending. On the beach were 3 kayaks, including ones which he knew had belonged to the headman of the village. These flimsy craft had been battered and torn by the wave action on the beach, evidence that they had been long neglected. Both Joe LaBelle and the Mounties who investigated after his report found the most puzzling bits of evidence when they looked into the empty huts and tents. There were the Eskimos' prized rifles standing forlornly beside the doors, awaiting their masters who never returned. Now in the far north, the rifle is more than a valued possession. It is a virtual life insurance policy. No Eskimo in his right mind would go on a long trip without his rifle. Yet here were the guns, and the Eskimos were gone. What about the dogs? The big, powerful brutes which were almost as important in this bleak land as the rifles. About 100 yards from the camp, LaBelle and the Mounties found 7 dogs. They'd been tied to the stumps of some scrubby trees, and all had died of starvation, as Canadian pathologists later confirmed. But the most baffling aspect of the entire enigma was found on the side of the camp opposite the bodies of the dogs. There the Eskimos had buried some member of their tribe under the customary cairn of stones. But this grave had been opened, the body removed, and the stones carefully stacked in 2 neat piles. Grave robbing is unthinkable to Eskimos, and animals could not have stacked the stones. The experts summoned by the Mounties spent 2 weeks examining every bit of evidence they could find at the deserted village. They came to the conclusion that the Eskimos had not been there for about 2 months when Joe LaBelle had arrived. This decision was based on the type of berries found in some of the cooking pots. Evidently, the village of about 30 inhabitants had been pursuing its normal way of life when for some reason they all rushed out of their huts and none of them ever got back from wherever had attracted their attention. For reasons unknown, the inhabitants of the village, men, women, and children, had left it, willingly or otherwise, in the dead of early winter. They had left so hurriedly they had abandoned their food on their fires, their prized guns, their dogs, their clothing. Skilled trackers failed to find any trail if they had fled over the tundra. The presence of their battered kayaks was mute evidence that they had not ventured out into the lake. And the plundered grave was just another bit of unexplained mystery. Months of patient and far-flung investigation failed to produce a single trace of any member who had lived in the deserted village of Anjikuni. The mounted police filed it as unsolved, and so it remains. This is two stories in one. This story takes place in the beautiful country of Mexico. I was about 10 years old. My family planned a vacation to my mother's hometown in Mexico. We live in Missouri and decided to drive there. So we had about a 2-day commute. Everything was just fine until we reached the border of Texas and Mexico. We noticed that my mother was asleep, and it looked as though she was having a nightmare. She began screaming, "No, no, don't touch me. Leave my family alone." Then she woke up. We asked her what happened, and she said that she had dreamt as we were crossing the border, all of the dead souls of Mexico began to surround the car and reach their arms into the car, grabbing her and the rest of us. She said that there were hundreds of them, and they were trying to stop us from getting in. The odd thing about this is that she dreamt about being at the border when in reality, we actually were at the border. She couldn't have known this. She was sleeping. So we made it through the border, and about 8 hours later, we made it to her hometown, Rio de Leon, Michoacan, Mexico. I do not remember much about the visit, but I do remember the day we went for a walk through the woods. It was a normal day, and me and my brothers and sisters decided there was absolutely nothing to do. All of the elders got together to make lunch, and we somehow were the only children there. We ate lunch and decided to go on a journey through the woods. Little did we know, it was a bad idea. We walked down the dirt road until it came to a dead end. From there, we walked through the plains that lead into a wooded area. We walked about 100 feet into the woods. Then it began to storm out of nowhere. This was very odd because it was a very sunny day, and there was no signs of a storm coming. We all looked at each other, very confused. Then all of a sudden we heard a woman cry. Her cry was painful and would end with a scream. I was so frightened, we all just stood there, frozen, and didn't say a word. The cry began to sound like it was getting closer. We just stood there, waiting to see what would happen. Suddenly, my sister let out the most horrifying scream ever. The rest of us looked at her, and she was staring up into the trees. We all looked at what she was looking at. I will never forget the scream, and I will never forget what I saw in the trees those days. A woman crucified about 40 feet up the tree. She looked down at us, and we looked up at her. She was wearing a faded, black, torn dress. Her hair was dark and tangled, had scars on her face and legs. She looked like a zombie. After a few seconds of us screaming and crying, we began to sprint out of the woods. We looked back and the woman was gone, but we kept running. As soon as we hit the plains, there was no more rain. We stopped running and recollected ourselves. We didn't understand why it wasn't raining anymore, and it looked like it had never rained. We walked back into the town and gathered with the elders. They noticed right away the terror on our faces and asked us our whereabouts. We told them our story, and to our surprise, they believed us. We cried as we told the story, and then sat back to hear the elders' explanation. They explained that about 100 years ago there was a woman who was accused of brujeria, accused of being a witch. She was murdered by the townspeople. Before her assassination, when she could walk the streets, people would throw things at her. Some would throw crucifixes. My grandmother said that there had been people that claimed to see her in the woods, but most of the reports were made by children. The raining was explained to be a sign of pain and sin. This encounter traumatized me as a child, I will never forget the sound of the woman's cries, followed by lightning and thunder. I couldn't speak of this to other children in school because no one believed me. I once told my best friend, but she laughed and said I freaked her out. After that, she never talked to me again. And from there on, I never told any of my stories to the kids at school. This story is about my grandmother. This happened several years before I was born. I heard about this story while my mom and her sisters were bonding together, reminiscing about their childhood, particularly about my grandmother. She's the same grandmother in my previous story, Displaced Entities. When my grandmother was young, she was not as religious as she used to be before she died in 2002. They lived in a house near the National Railroad. My grandparents were not rich, but my grandfather was a well known artist and painter in our hometown, and people usually asked him for a lot of artwork. My grandfather, however, was too kind hearted to charge people for his work, especially when it was commissioned by his friends. So he left a little money for his family. However, my grandfather's kind heartedness saved our family. All of his friends shouldered his funeral expenses, and some of them pledged to pay for my auntie's education expenses. Now, my grandmother, on the other hand, was loved by my grandfather very much. They got married at the age of 14 and 16 to save my grandmother from being taken by the Japanese Imperial Army during the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. She was spoiled and treated too indulgently, so when he died, my grandmother became depressed. She started playing mahjong with her friends and staying up to the wee hours in the morning. According to my mother, as the eldest among 7 children, she took the responsibility of looking after her siblings. She would stay up late waiting for grandma. My grandmother's gambling habit went from bad to worse until one scary evening when she had the most frightful experience. While she was on her way home at 3 a.m. from a friend's house, my grandmother saw a huge black dog a few feet away from her. The dog was so huge, it was like 5 feet tall, and it was just standing in the middle of the road staring at her. My grandmother was startled, as it was so unusual to see a dog that big. What scared her was how the dog was acting so strange. It was doing nothing and just staring at her, and she could also hear a growl, as if the dog was going to pounce at her. She started to walk fast, and her heart almost dropped when she had to walk past the dog, which was still staring at her. She kept on walking and was too scared to look back. When she turned on the next corner, she continued walking till she saw something weird from a distance. There was this huge gray bird perched at the end of a banana tree, just a few feet away. My grandmother stared intently at the large, powerfully built bird as she continued to walk forward. Its eyes were bright red, and it was staring back at her. The hair at the back of her neck started to raise when she realized the bird was perched at the edge of a banana stalk, which was physically impossible. My grandmother realized that what she was looking at was not an ordinary bird, but an aswang, or shapeshifter. The bird was too heavy for the banana stalk to sustain its weight, but it just stood there without taking a breath. The bird made a sudden, scary, screeching sound that made my grandmother jump and run. When she was a few feet away from the banana tree, she heard a sudden flapping of heavy wings from behind her, and she knew right then that the bird was flying towards her. My grandmother, in an instant, stooped down to avoid the bird as it flew over her head, its talons grazing her hair. According to my mom, flying aswangs normally grab their victims on their legs. Then they lift them up in the air and throw them in the ground to incapacitate their victims. That is the time that they devour their victims, once they've been disabled. My grandmother started shouting for help as she ran as fast as she could. She knew that there was no way that she could outrun the aswang, so she went inside a huge cement pipe at the side of the street, as there was a government construction project being done in that area. My grandmother hid there, crying and praying for her life. She could still hear the flapping of wings outside circling the area. Fortunately for her, the neighbors heard her cry for help. Houses started to switch on their lights, and people went out to check what was going on. The aswang left, and my grandmother crawled out from the cement pipe. From that day on, my grandmother stopped gambling and has never stayed up late outside again. She became a devout Christian until the day she left us.